Yes, thank you, Faye. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, I think we have people who are against Balochistan here earlier. Maybe they wanted to speak as well, but I don't think they would be speaking in favour of self-determination. That's another story. Yeah, independence, yes. Balochistan was once independent in 1948, but one can argue it was independent before that with a Khanate Balochistan, although the borders are more fluid in those days. But nevertheless, it was a distinct people with a distinct history of ruling themselves. Does it make any difference to the struggle? Well, it gives a certain authenticity that the holding power, Britain, at that time, accepted that Balochistan would exist at that point in time, albeit it didn't survive. And it didn't survive partly because Britain didn't want it to survive, but nevertheless, it was originally accepted by Britain. Britain originally wanted to give India independence, and Pakistan would never have existed if it wasn't for Jinnah pushing for a religious state different from, obviously, the Hindu India. So Britain really wanted to run away without deciding really any legacy, but it did. And to Britain's shame, it ran away when it mattered, when somebody wanted to challenge, i.e. Pakistan in this case, wanted to challenge the independence of Balochistan, Britain ran away, as I'm afraid most colonial powers did in the rush to decolonise, which was the right thing to do, but they never decided on any particular legacy in doing that, which is very disappointing. So is it important then to have been independent once? Well, there's plenty of people seeking independence, and many of them have no history of independence. You have. They haven't, but it doesn't mean to say that their struggle is less important. Self-determination isn't really about history, but it's about the here and now, about whether people want autonomy or independence from the state that they find themselves within. We have modern examples of Scotland, Quebec. Quebec has never been independent, yet the Canadians, at least 3 times I think, have allowed a referendum on the people of Quebec of whether they wanted to be an independent state. That is the democratic and the right way to go. And there's obviously other examples of that. Unfortunately, most of the world don't allow referendums, or if you do get a referendum, it's because of lots of other reasons we shall come on to. So it does help your moral and political and legal, to some extent, case if you've been independent in the past. There is some benefit of that history. But of course, it doesn't really, at the end of the day, give you and deliver you independence. I don't believe if we find some article or document of Britain saying, oh, we gave them independence, but really we're going to shaft Baloch. I don't think the British government will say, okay, we'll invade Pakistan now and restore that border. It won't work like that. However, in terms of getting people to support your cause, to accept your cause, the fact you have been independent, legitimately, in other words, through the United Nations and, of course, Britain, is of some comfort and some benefit. But let's not overplay it. So, you have the Tibetans. They were also a country. They obviously looking for independence. You've got the Uyghur in the west of China. I don't know if they've ever been independent. Obviously, you've got the Kurds, and you've got Kashmir, and they've never really been independent. But it doesn't mean to say that they never could be or shouldn't be. So, how can we change the facts on the ground to actually achieve that independence, whether you had it or never had it before? Well, strategically, I think, in truth, it's geopolitical events that determine whether countries become independent. And it's events in the particular region. I'll give you quite one obvious example, the Kurds. The Kurds have benefited from war, benefited from the Syrian war, they benefited from the Iraq war. Weren't intending to. In fact, you would regard it as coincidental, or collateral damage, if you like. But the Kurds, of course, are very close to getting independence in both those countries. This is the reason why, of course, Turkey is eager and desperate to invade Rojava, which is what they call the northern Syrian area, because they are frightened about the self-determinist contagion going across the border into Turkey, and that the Turkish Kurds, they may want independence too. Well, many of them probably already do, but it may give them heart. So clearly, that's an example of where things can change rapidly. So if you look 50 years ago, you'd never say the Kurds were getting independence. You said they were suppressed. There are many rebellions in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, failed long term all the time, and probably always would do. It was only outside interference, if you like, for want of a better word, that changed that. In other words, you wouldn't be able to get independence from your own volition. And there's many, many examples of that, which I won't bore you with tonight. But there's many examples of countries going for independence, being outgunned, if you like, by the oppressors. You won't be able to do it yourself. I can't think of any simple example of where that's happened. But the geopolitical change can do that. So where does that put you guys? Well, if there's a fourth Indo-Pakistani war, because of Kashmir or anything else, maybe Pakistan will collapse and there'll be dismemberment of Pakistan. There would be an opportunity for that to happen. Equally, Iran, if the United States invaded Iran or Iran decided to invade somewhere else and there was a conflict, then Iran may become dismembered. In other words, it's not something you can control to initiate normally, but it's something you could exploit should it happen. So one clue is you always need to be ready to exploit that opportunity should it exist. Fundamentally, it is to say outside intervention that makes a difference. And unfortunately, it's outside intervention that we cannot determine, we cannot control it. It will just happen. But what you must be is be prepared for that situation. And, you know, you don't have to be, it's not like winning the lottery. You can predict that there's conflict between India and Pakistan. You can predict there's conflict between Iran and other countries. It's not something that's going to be totally out of the blue. So you best be organising now for that possibility. And the Baloch are very similar to the Kurds in the sense that they're split amongst more than two countries. Most self-determinists are trapped within one country. You're blessed because you're trapped within maybe four. The Kurds are probably worse, but nevertheless, look at their situation now. You know, two have possibly gone in their way. Sorry to keep going back to the Kurds example. I'll give you another example. South Sudan. Many people would say, "Oh, South Sudan, they got their independence." Let's walk it back. They got their independence because they got a referendum, and they only got a referendum because Sudan allowed them a referendum. And the reason that happened is because Bashir, who was the president then, was under threat of being taken by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to trial. And he thought that he could buy off, for himself personally, a freedom, a trade-off, if you allowed the South Sudanese, to have a referendum, which I think everybody should have around the world if it's necessary. Absolutely, that should be our watchword as a principle, not just for the Baloch, but for everybody, should they wish it. They only got that because Bashir thought it would do him a favour. Okay? The South Sudanese army didn't defeat the Sudanese army. It was never going to. Be fighting a 30-odd-year war, one of the longest wars. To their credit, they were still fighting, but they were never going to win. So it was another dynamic, an external dynamic, which again you couldn't have predicted that. You couldn't have predicted that, but it happened, and they exploited the situation. They won that referendum, and South Sudan, although there's lots of problems, they got their independence. So again, there's lots of factors involved. So what's happening in the future? Is anything changing strategically in the future? Well, I think there is, and that's not talking about the specific regions we're talking about here. I believe at the moment an increasing number of people in the world, including diplomats, politicians, are coming round to the idea of self-determination. Possibly they wouldn't argue it in that way, but they're starting to accept that there should be a new deal around the world. And it's developing. Basically, since the fall of empires, the world's elites have really wanted to consolidate and centralise power in supranational bodies like the EU, the OES, the African Union, all kinds of supranational bodies, some more political than others, but nevertheless, the elites like talking to the elites. They don't want to talk to us, they want to talk to people like them, and they do deals. And some of them, of course, have wanted to pool sovereignty. Africa's tried it many times. They're trying to have unified governments. African Union have tried to say, oh, well, let's all work as a region. Never happened, but never will. I think the differences are too great. But nevertheless, they've tried to force governments to work together and ultimately, in my opinion, in the EU's case, create a new state. So in other words, you wouldn't have a nation state in Europe, you'd have one that would call itself a nation, which you wouldn't in my opinion, but nevertheless, it wants to centralise things and control the world. The United Nations was an example of that. It's a failed example. Of course, United Nations is now toothless and it's just a talking shop. It's no power. I'm not saying it should have power, but it's really just a talking shop and nobody really takes a lot of notice. Certainly not politically. But I think things are changing because I think many governments around the world are becoming tired of it. And although you may or may not disagree on Brexit in Britain, but I think one of the vehement opposition to that event or to that vote was from the elites, because it was undermining what they thought was inevitable, that they would control regions, they would work together. And of course, what that means is that people like yourselves are anathema, are out of that sync. You know, you're not going to talk about having united this, that and the other if in fact you're going to give freedom and independence for a new country. I always remember, I've said it before, Lord Malloch Brown was a foreign minister. I don't know if it was the foreign minister, but it was a minister in the foreign office a few years ago now. It was at a large meeting, and it was a Tamil event, and I think it was just shortly after the end of the war, or near it. And he was asked, why don't you support self-determination? He took back the Falkland Islands, wanting self-determination. Gibraltar, in the British context, they should have self-determination. But what about other peoples? And all he could say was, that's not part of our agenda. We don't really want self-determination because it's too complicated for the world's leaders. It's too complicated because there'd be more countries we'd have to talk to. What a pathetic answer that is. But that was the authentic voice of the world's political elites. They don't support what you want because it's more difficult for them. It goes against, counterintuitive to what they want. So, where does that leave us? So what can you do as diaspora? Regardless of whether I'm correct and that people are moving towards more national independence, which in my opinion, you just transfer that to your situation. Well, if I've got independence, you should have it. But you as diaspora is obviously in a very difficult situation. You're small numbers of people in a large country, or numbers of people. You have lots of competition. Lots of other small communities are campaigning. And of course, the indigenous people of this island is competing for politicians' ears all the time on everything. Some things the same for the National Health Service like yourselves, or something specific to them. So there's lots of competition for the politicians' ear. But I think you have to lobby. You have to lobby politicians. You have to lobby diplomats. You have to lobby the media and ultimately the public too. Extremely important that you do that. Even though it's only a grain of sand, perhaps, your impact. But it has to be done, because what else are you going to do? And it also has to be to those people, not to your own community, primarily, but to people who've got influence and power in the country that you are. In this country, obviously Britain, you may be in Germany or Sweden, and obviously it's the same there too. You have to work on the people who have influence and power, but that's not just the politicians. Increasingly now, it's the public, and it's the media, social media in particular, and diplomats, of course, all of those people. So I think the tide is turning. I think we need to focus on that lobbying. In one small way, I got involved in that. Nations Without State supported a party in the European elections 2014 to fight on this very topic. And for awareness, not for votes, it was for awareness, and it achieved that somewhat. and it's looking at doing it again in the London elections next year, the Assembly elections, we could do the same thing. I'd like to see the Baloch involved in that as well. It may upset a few people, but it has to be done. And therefore we can promote the self-determinist cause, whether it's the Baloch or the Tibetans or the Tamils or whoever and whomever. That's what we have to do. A grain of sand, yes, but you won't win without creating that awareness. And the most important thing to do, of course, is that you need to unite amongst other diasporas, because your struggle's the same as the Tibetan struggle, albeit at probably smaller numbers than even you here. But nevertheless, the principle's the same. They once had a country, you once had a country, you should restore your power. So, my final point is that you have to just continue doing what I'm sure you wish to do, but you have to focus more on the external forces. You have to recruit, you have to lobby people who are not in your community. I know you spend a lot of time trying to have unity and trying to get people working together. I know that's almost very, very difficult. People have got different ways to nirvana, and they've got different, maybe have different types of regimes if they ever had power. But that's a problem. But really, if you're just speaking to yourselves, you'll never ever win. That's a fact. You have to, and I once went to a demonstration quite 10 years ago, maybe less, when I first got involved, and it was all in a different, it wasn't in, they were marching, and they had posters and banners, and it wasn't in English. And people were looking at it, I wonder what that says. So, you know, you have to think more cleverly than that. You're not appealing to your own people here, you're appealing to every other types of people. So we will support you in that way, whether it's through elections or through just pressure groups, whatever. But you need to step up to that. And ultimately, you keep lobbying till the stars align. And the stars align is some geopolitical change in the region, plus a friendly government or friendly officials who are no longer fearful of Baloch being independent or of any community being independent, which they are now. And I think things are moving your way. So hopefully one day we'll celebrate your independence again. Thank you.